Well, okay, so we have this issue, this concept that we're all interested in, this phenomenon of wisdom, and it's a difficult concept to get your head around, and it's sometimes, I think, hard to understand what's at stake when you're thinking of the phenomenon of wisdom. And one of the things that people sometimes do when they're thinking about a concept or a phenomenon that's difficult to get a grasp of is that they try to think about it in relation to other concepts. The starting point for my project has to do with the fact that it seems to me that in the history of the West, at least the philosophical history of the West, something like this understanding of wisdom in terms of something else has grounded two of the main lines of research. So one of the lines of research, I think, goes back to Socrates and Plato, and that's the line of research that says something like, well, wisdom is, or at least it requires, knowledge of a certain domain. But an alternate tradition comes from Aristotle, and on the Aristotelian notion, wisdom doesn't require explicit knowledge of the principles of right action or the principles of good action. What wisdom really requires is experience. So the wise person, in Aristotle's terminology, the phronimos, the person of practical wisdom, is the person who's had lots and lots of experience in living a life. They've had the right kind of experience. They've responded to it in the right kinds of ways. And this experience allows them not to know what it is in virtue of which some action is the right action or an appropriate action or the good action, but just to see directly what's required by the situation. These are two different views about wisdom and its relation to knowledge. On the Socratic Platonic view, wisdom requires knowledge of the rational principles underlying the domain of the good. And on the Aristotelian view, desire for knowledge of the rational principles might actually get in the way of your becoming a wise agent or a wise actor in certain domain. Players. Grandmaster chess players, it turns out, do very little deliberating when they're playing Grandmaster chess. When they're playing against really strong opponents, they look at a setup on the board, and it immediately occurs to them that there are 2 or 3 viable options. And to the extent that they deliberate, they spend their time thinking about those 2 or 3 viable options. But they don't see an enormous panoply of options the way a computer program would. But what's even more interesting is that when they're playing master level chess, if they just do what immediately occurs to them, they will win virtually all of the time. So they, in some sense or another, see directly what's required by the situation without having to reason it out, and in particular without understanding in any sense the rational principles underlying the goodness of that action. So the project that I'm interested in is called Saving Wisdom from Knowledge. So I don't think that the Socratic Platonic model is a good model of wisdom for roughly Aristotelian reasons. So my project is devoted to reviving a broadly speaking Aristotelian kind of view of wisdom. And on this view, living a good life is going to require acquiring experience in various domains of a certain sort and in the right way, so that one can see directly what's required by a situation rather than understand the underlying principles on the basis of which it's required. And in virtue of this seeing directly, you can, as Aristotle says, do the appropriate thing at the appropriate time in the appropriate way. The project that I'm interested in has 3 parts. So the first part has to do with reviewing the existing literature of mastery and local skill domains, kind of idea. The second thing I want to do is articulate a kind of distinction, though, between mastery in a local skill domain and this general notion of living a good life I'd like to spell out. And then finally, the last thing I want to do is develop a proposal, a sort of practical application of this Aristotelian view about what general education will look like if you don't have at the center of it a notion of critical reasoning so that we can rationally understand the principles of right action in a certain situation, but rather we have something like the acquisition of experience in such a way as to allow you to see directly what needs to be done in a certain situation. That's a big practical project, and there are all sorts of details that we can go into, but I think that's enough for the overview.